Hello, I'm Skye Seipp, Editor-in-Chief of the student media organization, the Etc. at Eastfield College. I am hosting today's panel for the Human Rights Fair that is taking place this week. My guests today are three Eastfield employees and current and former journalists. To my left over here is Lori Dan. She is a journalism professor, program coordinator, and a former journalist. She spent 20 years working as an editor and reporter in Alabama, South Carolina, and Texas. And she also spent time working at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Below me here is Beth Langton. She is a former Dallas Morning News reporter, Eastfield journalism instructor, and now is a marketing specialist at Eastfield. Below me is Kel Offord. She is also a photojournalism professor at Eastfield, and she is a current and former freelance photographer who has had 2 books published and has won numerous awards for her work. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I want to start with a question for you, Lori, and that is, what is the role of media?
Well, specifically the news media is, the role of the news media is to obviously inform people about what's going on in their local communities, in the country and all over the world. As journalists, we have a seat at the table where other people don't, right? We have an opportunity to ask questions of people in power. And I think when we talk about the media being essential to democracy, that's why, because the news media does hold people in power accountable for their actions and is really a voice for the public, a voice, for the voiceless.
And why is that important whenever we're in a crisis and pandemic like we're in now?
Well, yeah, so obviously right now, news and information is vital for people, both in terms of, from a health perspective. This is both a health crisis and an economic crisis. So I feel like there's the role of the media here is extremely important to get information to people so that they know what's happening in terms of, how they should approach protecting themselves from the virus, but also providing resources for people who are really struggling economically during this time. So I think, for example, with what you guys have done, Skye, with the Etc., one of the best things you did, I thought, was providing that list of resources for students, students who've been laid off, students who, need health care, students who didn't know how they were going to pay for their textbooks. I got a lot of great feedback from my students who used some of those resources and didn't have to pay for their books this semester, and it was a huge help to them. So those are just, some of the little things the media can do, but obviously and I know we're going to talk about this later, but there's obviously a much bigger responsibility when it comes to how the government is handling this pandemic and the government's response or lack of response at different times, questioning why nothing happened in February. All of those things are very important for the news media to call attention to.
Yeah. And Beth, for you, you spend a lot of time covering local news. And why is it important that we keep up with any type of news, even whenever we're not kind of engulfed in a pandemic like we are now?
Yeah, following the news can sometimes feel a little overwhelming. Especially in the 24-hour news cycle where everything's available on your phone at any moment, it feels like you're being bombarded with information. But you really have to stay in touch with what's going on, because even the things that feel like they don't affect you, so maybe things that are happening in a foreign country, so maybe like China, before anything happened here, what was happening in China, what was happening in Italy were kind of peeks into what was going to happen for us in the near future. And even like things that are things happen in Washington, we might feel like, well, that doesn't really affect me, but government does affect us. The stimulus package is a good example of how something that is happening in Washington and playing out there has a direct effect on people in their own lives, in their own communities. And so staying in touch with news is vital for you to, not just during this time, but all the time, to know what's going to happen in our lives.
Yeah, great. And Kale, a lot of your work has kind of directly involved really trying to show stories that maybe we don't hear. They're not normally prominent figures that you're covering. Your work with the Iraq War in 03 and 04, that was published into the book Unembedded, and then also your book on climate change that you did, Bottom of the Boot. All of those kind of dealt with stories that we don't always hear a lot. Kind of, I guess, why is that important for us to tell those stories?
Well, I teach photography as well as practice photojournalism. And I often hear students say things like, well, I'm sick of politics, or I don't like politics. I try not to pay too much attention to it. It just gives me a headache. But politics is people, and whatever's happening in our country and our communities does affect us, whether or not we want to tune into it. So what I try to do in my work is show images of how big stories or big policies affect ordinary individual people. So I go from the policy level, I sort of, try to educate myself about what's happening in, say, climate change or the pandemic, and then think about, well, how will that impact the individuals in my community or people that I can get access to? So I can tell the story, the big story, in a very small way. And I feel like, I hope, and I think that kind of journalism, that kind of visual connection that you can make between people by showing people's faces, the insides of their homes, what their relationships look like, that will make the story feel more personal and feel relevant and not so overwhelming to people who might otherwise tune out of politics.
Yeah, great. And Lori, for you, you teach a mass communications class. It's a required course that a lot of students take. And I know that you ask them kind of what kind of news, how do they normally get their news? And what is the response that you hear?
So a lot of students get their news from social media, which, on the surface seems kind of scary because we know that there's a lot of misinformation that is spread very easily on social media. But I try to teach them that you can still follow the news on social media. It's just all about the sources you follow. Don't share stuff from your uncle who is using all kinds of questionable sources when he shares information on Facebook. But if you follow, actual news media sources, if you follow, sources that are going to give you accurate and trustworthy, reliable information, then there's nothing wrong with getting your news from social media. I get a lot of my news from social media, from Twitter, because it's a shortcut. It's a way to kind of get to information quickly and as it happens. So I don't see anything wrong with that. It's just the way you use that tool. And then also a lot of students do get their news from cable news, which I find a little more troubling, just because we've blurred the lines so much between fact and opinion on cable news networks. And I do think that there's more obvious bias in a lot of what we see on cable news networks.
That's all cable news, right?
I think so. I think, and I'm not saying that all cable news is biased, right? I think that there's some really good reporting that's done on cable news. But part of the problem is, how do you determine what's reporting and what's opinion? And so one thing that students fail to do sometimes is recognize the difference between opinion and news. And so one of the assignments we do in mass communication is a news analysis, where they analyze two different news sources, and they have to kind of talk about how each news source covered the story. And so that gets them looking at things like framing, how the story was framed by the source. It also gets them thinking about if there's any bias. How is the Fox News report different from the CNN report, so on and so forth. And a lot of times what they'll do, I've noticed, is they'll pick out articles when it's a print story that's clearly labeled opinion, and they'll use that as an example of bias. But that is not, there's a difference between opinion and news, and it's okay to have both as long as it's clearly marked, clearly labeled.
Okay, great. And Beth, as a former journalist, whenever you're writing a news story, do they just throw in their opinions to that news story?
Absolutely not. Rookie journalism students are often fall back on the on opinion because it doesn't require a lot of research. But the truth is that journalism requires research. You can't write a story without sources, and sources can be people, sources can be documents, sources can be videos. There's a lot of different ways you can gather information. But the most important thing is you have to gather that information. And then from there, you have to evaluate your sources. You have to decide, is this a credible source? So when we talk about the pandemic, we talk about the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, because these are expert sources. These are people, this is what they do for a living. This is how they spend their lives. They're researching all of this. A family doctor in Wisconsin might not have the same information about infectious disease that these experts have who spend their lives working on these topics. So you really have to, there's a little bit of audience participation involved here. I can use any of those sources in my story, but it's kind of up to the audience to evaluate, are those credible sources? And for the journalist, the most important thing is credibility. You have to find people who really know what they're talking about. And that's not the journalist.
Okay, great. And Kel, how about for photojournalists? I mean, can you just go around and Photoshop whatever you want out of an image to make it look better, or?
No, photojournalists have ethical guidelines as well, like print journalists do, or other journalists in other forms of media. So we have to be also well informed. I mean, we can't just even report only with our cameras. We have to make sure that we're keeping up to date with the news, that we're reading the most credible sources, that we fact check what people say for our captions, which is text that accompanies our pictures. We have to make sure that that information is also credible and accurate as the best of our ability, or if it's someone's opinion, we put it in quotes and it's very clear that this is this person's statement, the person that we're quoting. But in terms of the work that we do, we have to be there in person on the front line. We can't report by phone. We can't report by Zoom. We have to be there in a place, in a time and place when things are happening, which puts us at a certain amount of risk, but that's our ethical obligation as photographers, that we have to be willing to take a certain amount of risk to get the frontline access or the individual personal stories of people who are being directly impacted. So we have to see them in person. We have to be there. And we can't change things in our pictures after we make those photographs. We make the images of things that we see in front of our camera. We don't, as photojournalists, arrange things, move things around, take things out of the scene, either while we're photographing or afterwards.
Yeah. And I mean, that kind of goes to, right, Beth, like there's a certain amount of ethics and standards that most journalists are trying to follow, right?
Absolutely. So the Society of Professional Journalists has a very elaborate ethics policy, and it involves things like obviously telling the truth, not misrepresenting yourself as a journalist. We don't lie to people to get stories. We're always upfront. We have standards for how we report, when we report, and so it's really important that we uphold these guidelines so that people can trust us. And especially in this time that we're in right now, we're being attacked by the President of the United States as not being trustworthy. And so it's very hard to kind of build trust in an audience that when you're being undermined. But I think the most important thing is to just act like a human being. That's what I tell my students too, and that sometimes they laugh, but if you treat others well and you're honest, then you're going to get the best story and it's going to be accurate.
Great. And I mean, speaking of that with the president, there's a lot of talk now of fake news. Lori, what is fake news?
Well, it's not what a lot of people think it is. It's not news that makes somebody look bad. It's not news that is So I ask my students this when we start talking about fake news. That's the first question I ask. What do you think fake news is? And I'm always like really interested to hear what they think. And generally, what they think is it's news that is inaccurate. And I try to tell them that is not fake news. I mean, that it is going to happen. There are going to be stories that have errors in them. But that is not fake news. Fake news is intentionally deceptive information that, it has a purpose, and it's not always a political purpose. Sometimes, most times actually, it's to make money. I mean, clicks make money. And so, when fake news first, when it was first like really becoming big, I mean, actual fake news, we saw a lot of people who, there were stories about people in other countries who are making lots of money just making up all kinds of stories. And what they do is they prey on our biases. They prey on our that confirmation bias we're all looking for. If we don't like a certain political candidate, we're going to be more apt to click on a link that looks like it's going to be a negative article about that candidate. And we saw that in the 2016 election a lot. And because there was so much fake news, and of course, we found out that a lot of this came from other countries, but because there was so much fake news, it caused Facebook to kind of take a look at how they were handling information and to start like at least looking at, I think there's still problems, obviously, but at least start looking at the type of information that was posted or misinformation that was posted to its site. So fake news is basically made up news. If you guys would like, I could show you one of the things we do in our class to kind of talk about fake news. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen here. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so this is a exercise that I let my students do to kind of see how well they can judge fake news. So maybe we can all do a couple of questions here, so you can see how well you guys would do on a quiz such as this. So this is the website is factitious.au. I can't remember exactly, but if you look up factitious and fake news, you'll find this link. And they have a pandemic edition right now. So all the articles that are in this fake news quiz are related to the pandemic. So you would just start a new game, and we'll look at one news story.
Oh, so it's like Tinder. So you swipe right if it's fake, left.
Okay, I didn't say that. That was you. You young journalists. Okay, yeah, so yes, it is so you can play this on your phone. You can swipe, but I'm playing it on my laptop right now. So I'm gonna just read this. I tell my students, read the whole thing, including the headline and the story. There are things you can look for in a fake news. If you're like really looking at a news article through a critical lens, if you see gross misspellings, errors, if you see attribution, like the sources are just named like by their first name or aren't named at all, these are all clues that this might not be, a real source, or that it might not be a real news story. So a woman with the coronavirus who gave doctors a fake name and address and vanished has been found, authorities said Tuesday. The unidentified woman walked into the East Orange General Hospital on Saturday, where she was then tested for COVID-19, said Newark Mayor Ross Baraka. A positive result was returned. However, she provided a false name and a Newark address. Okay, so if we read this whole story, it seems like a basic news story, right? I don't see anything, but you do have to be careful and read the whole story, because what a lot of fake news stories will do is use actual news, but then insert something in there that is hyperbolic, right? That is kind of, sensational in some way. So if we do show source, this shows that it came from the New York Daily News. And I tell my students the most important thing is to look at the source. What is the source of the information? So what do you guys think? New York Daily News, this story, do we think it's real or fake?
That is a real news publication.
That is a real news publication. So we're going to, now if you were, if you were reading this, you know, in real life and we had time to do all this, you might check and see if this was published by other news outlets just to verify, right? But for the purposes of speed, we'll look, yes, this is a news article, but it also points out that the New York Daily News doesn't always have the most accurate information, so you still need to be careful when using this source. So let's go to another one. This will be the last one we do. So Bill and Melinda Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others predicted up to 65 million deaths via coronavirus. In simulation ran 3 months ago, right? And we've got an exclamation point at the end. Well, as all journalism students know, we don't use a lot of exclamation points in journalism. So that's my first clue that something may be off about this story. Also, we're missing an article right on the first sentence on the lead here. Foundation also funded group. This kind of reads like a headline or something, not a complete sentence. And then if you keep going and read through here, you'll see some other kind of like, here we go. New York City is NYC. A real journalist would not use NYC on first reference. So these are
not
like
AP style, right? So there's certain like standards that we use, and the exclamation points, we don't use them because we try to keep an objective, even tone, right? That we don't sort of try to get breathless in our reporting.
There you go.
At least not when we're speaking.
That told me you get three chances in your career as a journalist.
3 in your life, yes.
Yep.
Unless you go into marketing later, then you get extra.
So yeah, so all of these are red flags. The NYC Associated Press style, which is what journalists use, would say New York City would spell that out. So all of this makes me think this is probably not an accurate story. And then when I hit show source, Infowars.com. Anyone know much about Infowars?
Alex Jones.
This is Alex Jones. So we know that this is not a real news site. And so, yeah, that's right. That was a fake article. And then it tells you what Infowars is. So this is a important tool that I use just to kind of illustrate how, and some of the stories actually, those are pretty cut and dry, but some of them are, some of them sound fake, but they're really real. And some of them sound real, but they're really fake. And there are levels that you can do if you want to use this in your classes or just to be a more informed and media literate person. You can take these quizzes regularly. They do update the information. So I think it's super important. My mass comm class has a heavy dose of media literacy in it because I just think it's so important for students to be able to navigate this 24/7 news environment that we're in now.
So Cal, so for you, whenever you're looking at news, how do you figure out if it's biased or if it's a credible news site?
Well, I use a lot of the same techniques that Lori's talking about. I mean, because I'm a journalist, I'm familiar with a lot of the news sources, but even sometimes a news source that, like the New York Daily News or the New York Post, not the best newspapers, sometimes they'll alert me to a study that I'm kind of interested in because I like to follow the science behind this virus. For me personally, you know, I have little kids, I have elderly parents. I'm thinking about how to keep everybody safe. So I'm really following like the latest information. And also me and my students, we're exposed. We go out there into the public sometimes. So I really want to know scientifically what's going on. So sometimes a news source that I'm not a huge fan of will post an interesting study and or they'll write about the study, and then there will be a link to the study in the story. So I often use news stories as a gateway to get to scientific information that people are reporting about. But I'll go to the study itself and then I'll look at it and see, well, is this peer reviewed? Is this in a journal that's credible? And I'll actually do a little research about the scientific source. And with something like this particular story, I think all of us as citizens have to become a little bit more savvy about science and how it works and where it comes from. So that's something that I do. And then I'm constantly publishing things on my Facebook feed, which I use to get stories and information out to my friends, my colleagues. I follow a lot of journalists on Facebook, and I see what they're reporting in the community, and I see what they're reposting. So you can follow journalists on social media, and that can actually be a decent source for finding good stories. I don't know if this is a good time for me to show a couple of photographs that there are from stories that I have seen and reposted for either my students for educational purposes or for my friends and family. But let's see, we have a little bit of time left. Shall I try to share the screen and show these now? Oh, it's not going to work. I didn't set it up the right way based on my last experience. So I'll leave and set it up. But does anyone else want to speak to that?
Oh, okay.
Well, I think, yeah, and I meant to mention this earlier too, and that's a really good point about hyperlinks and stories. That's one of the great things about the internet is that you can go directly to the source. A lot of times I'll see something posted on Facebook, and it seems like an interesting story, but I'm not really that comfortable with the source. And so I'll open it up and look at it. And sure enough, sometimes it's like, according to the Washington Post, and I'm like, oh, I can go read the Washington Post story instead of this recap of the Washington Post story. And then in the Washington Post story, they're going to link me to all the documents that they used or to the website where, of the company that the person they interviewed works. So then I can go look at all of those sources for myself. Whereas when you have a print product, as much as I have a soft spot in my heart for print newspapers, that's not possible. We can't print the entire, 123-page scientific study. That's not possible. That is the internet. It gives us a gateway to all of that information.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that gateway. It's so useful to us now because we're all stuck at home, right?
Yes.
So we always tell students to use use the primary source, not the secondary source, right? So you don't want to get your information from the BuzzFeed article that recaps the New York Times article. So go straight to the New York Times. That's a great point.
Right. So can you see my screen here? We take the dead from morning till night.
Yes.
All right, this is a story from the New York Times, and I'll add that Eastfield students, at least our media students, our journalism students, they have free access to the New York Times, don't they?
Yes.
So I think, do all students on campus, can they all get that access?
Yes.
That's excellent. So you can get free access to the New York Times, and I'll mention that many publications are offering free access to their coronavirus coverage right now. So some of the best publications in the country are offering everything for free to everyone in the nation, which is so crucial. Of course, it hurts them financially, but we need this. We need this information. So this is a story in the New York Times. This is just the credit. You can see the New York Times is here in the masthead. This is from Bergamo, Italy, one of the worst hit cities facing the most deadliest form of the outbreak because people were living close. It started early there, a lot of elderly people in the community. And here I'm showing you what their coverage looks like and the way that the photojournalist, you can see just how close they have to get to the victims of this virus, and right there with the frontline responders from the Red Cross. Everyone's wearing masks except for the man here who's sick in bed. I mean, this photographer is definitely within range of getting sick himself, and he's an Italian photographer who followed this story here on the front lines. So you can see how, people are getting sick around us, but we don't get to see it because they're at home, they're behind their closed walls. But through photojournalism, we're brought to this bedside of this ailing man in Italy. And it changes the way you see the virus. I mean, you can imagine yourself or your family or your loved ones in this hospital. You can see the care workers and everyone's on oxygen, and how the halls are lined with people who are ill because the hospital system is overwhelmed there. So this is what frontline journalism reporting looks like. And in this city, they've even brought the military in to bury the dead who are being warehoused because people were dying at such an alarming rate that it wasn't even possible to get them buried fast enough. So bodies were being stored in warehouses in Bergamo. So this is what frontline journalism can do for us, photojournalism can do for us. You can see the expressions on these people's faces, their weariness, their anxiety. It brings us closer to the experience, and I think probably makes us a little more cautious ourselves when we see what the consequences can be. At least I think that's part of our motivation for showing those environments. And then here, this is Barbara Davidson, who's a freelance photographer. She was a Dallas Morning News photographer and then an LA Times photographer. And now she's freelance like so many photojournalists, which means that she sells her work to multiple publications and takes assignments from multiple publications. And here she is on the streets of LA, photographing people on one street corner, making these repetitive portraits. You can see stylistically in terms of light and posing and distance to the subject, things are all very similar, and everyone is wearing a mask because in LA, people are required to wear a mask in public. So this is a really, again, a very personal look at how people's lives are being impacted by the virus and how the demographics are very democratic. This affects everyone in a similar way. It doesn't matter what walk of life they're from, what they look like, how they're dressed. Everybody is impacted and has to wear a mask and think about their own public safety. I just love these photographs. It makes it feel very human and very personal. You can place yourself in the city on this street because the photographer did that for us. And in this last image, and this is, by the way, this is her Facebook feed. So I follow her like I follow many photojournalists. You can also follow photojournalists on Instagram, and they'll post for you the work that they're doing at the time. It's really nice to see a snapshot of the country this way right now in the world. Actually, people all over the world, professionals, are posting their work on social media. And then here we have one last portrait of a man whose wife he lost to the virus, and it happened very suddenly. It's a very moving story. It's from the Washington Post. You can see the credit down here at the bottom, Chris Bergen for the Washington Post. And these stories are from a series called Stories of the Pandemic, which I think is a really powerful series the Washington Post is doing. They're profiling ordinary people. Some of them are frontline healthcare workers. Some of them have lost family members to the virus or have been touched in some other way. And the accounts are in their voice in the first person. You can see that by the quotes here. So that's what quotation marks mean in journalism, that this is the man in the photograph who's speaking. And there are these extended sort of monologues by these characters. So you get inside of their head and their experience. It's a really moving series, very personal. And they're all led by these intimate portraits that are made with a longer lens, which means these photographers are at least 6 feet away from the subjects. But I feel like in these images, I can really see the pain in people's faces. I can see, look at this man. I mean, his brow is furrowed. He's just lost his wife of many years to this virus. And you feel for him. And he feels like a human being in front of you, in front of the camera this way. And you can imagine your own family members in similar circumstances. So photojournalism has that kind of immediacy, and you can find it in many different places right now that will make this very strange moment seem more real.
Yeah. I mean, it really makes you, like you said, realize that this man, he just lost his wife, and you can see that pain in him. And for a lot of people, maybe they need to see that because they might not think that this is a big deal, or that they just need to go back to work or whatever. And this can kind of be a tool to kind of help show what, in this time at least, what's happening around the world.
Yeah, I think it's a powerful time for photojournalism because we're all isolated and we can't see each other. This literally brings us into the view of other human beings who are impacted by this, in ordinary people in ordinary circumstances.
Yeah. Beth, when covering a crisis or a pandemic like this, how does news media kind of walk that line of not turning it into sensationalism, but still giving people facts that are important for them?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that the discussions that have been happening are, should the media be broadcasting President Trump's press conferences live? And there are some media outlets have decided that they are not going to do them live because they feel like he's using the platform for reasons other than informing the public about what's going on and what the government is doing and how to be safe. And oftentimes he does speak off the top of his head and says things that we later find out are not true. And so, but he is the president of the United States. He is in charge of the government response here. And so you kind of have to balance, what's happening in that room and the value of the information versus the danger of spreading misinformation. And then I think the most important thing here is, and Kale just talked about this, is telling the human stories of what's happening. Yes, what's happening to the stock market affects all of us. It affects our 401ks, which I'm not looking at mine. I don't want to know how much it's lost. And those are important things. But the things that are going to gut punch people are the things that are happening in their own communities, to their friends and families and coworkers, that affect them personally. Job losses are a huge thing. Food pantries are being overrun. Loved ones are having to say goodbye over a FaceTime video instead of being in a hospital room and holding someone's hand. And I did that for my mother. I know how important that is. And so those are the types of stories that I think are crucial to tell in this time. And that's not sensationalism. That's humanity.
What would you say sensationalism is? Like, I guess.
I think sensationalism is blowing things out of proportion, taking small things and making them big. A lot of times we see gotcha journalism, and while there is a place for holding powerful people to account, for asking them direct questions, for getting information, kind of making those, making big stories out of, say, a verbal slip, like somebody who accidentally says something. We've just been talking here for almost an hour, and it's very hard to articulate your thoughts. And imagine doing that in front of a room full of journalists. It can be very intimidating, and sometimes people slip up. And when they slip up, we should try to correct the information without pointing fingers and making things bigger than they are.
Social media will do that for you.
Yes.
And Lori, what are some of the challenges that journalists are having to face right now as they're covering this?
Wow. Yeah, a lot of challenges. Just pointing back to what Beth was just saying, I think when you have news conferences where inaccurate information is being put out there, there are challenges on how you handle that. I think it's a little concerning to me when I see what looks like attacks in the middle of those. These should be conferences that tell people, that let people know what the government is doing for you right now, that let people know like what is happening right now. It shouldn't be a bully pulpit. Like, it shouldn't be an opportunity for the president to talk about things he doesn't like about the media. I mean, that's not very important right now. I mean, we all know how he feels about the media. But when an NBC reporter asks him, what do you tell people who are scared? And then he lashes out at that reporter and says, I tell them you're a terrible reporter. It's just, I think I cannot imagine right now being one of those White House correspondents. That is a very difficult job. So, but that's a small minority of journalists, obviously. I think the challenge that most journalists have is access, right? Just access. You guys have all talked about how important it is to put a face on a story, and it's very difficult when we can't be face to face with people like we normally are. We can't, when we all teach about journalism, we talk about intimacy and, gaining trust, and how do you gain trust over a Zoom call? Or how do you gain trust, like when you're at the street and they're on the porch? Like, it's just really hard to do that right now. And I'd be interested to know, Skye, like some of the things you're, as a student journalist, I would imagine that you guys are running into some of those same challenges.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, one of our main ways of gathering sources is to just walk the beat, as they say, and walk around campus and talk to students or talk to instructors or employees and figure out what's going on. And now we don't have that option. Now everything is done via email, or running the newsroom is done through Slack and through Zoom calls. So half of your day is spent, having these conversations with people and doing that. And then also too, a lot of phone interviews. And I've kind of gotten used to conducting those, and there's definitely room for improvement, but it lacks that face-to-face. And even the few Zoom interviews that I've done have been different, because it doesn't seem to get any more normal. I know Kale, we were talking about that in class the other day. Like every time that we have another Zoom class or conversation, it just feels like even weirder than it did the first time.
No, it's not normalizing. It's just the longer it goes on, it seems that it feels more and more estranged. We feel more estranged in some ways, that this is becoming normal feels abnormal.
Right.
To me anyway.
Kale, I know there's a challenge too for you as an instructor, like teaching photojournalism students and having assignments for them during, when we're supposed to be social distancing and not really out.
Right. Yeah, it's a dilemma. And I ask my students, first of all, decide what you are comfortable doing, what you feel you are prepared to do. Some of my students are journalism majors and some are not. The ones who are not journalism majors and who are sheltering at home, I'm not asking them to go out into the streets and encounter strangers for my class. I just don't think that's ethical on my part as an instructor. And not to mention, there's one thing that I haven't said, which is that all of us now are part of the story, journalists or not. You may be, as a journalist, in a circumstance that makes your story applicable to many other people. I have a friend, Paula Bronstein, who's a freelance photographer, and she just lost her father during this virus. He wasn't, I don't remember how he died or what took him. He was 100 years old, but she couldn't attend his funeral. Her family couldn't go to the funeral. So she actually got a press pass to cover his funeral. And so that she could be there in person, and she photographed it. And then that story actually got picked up by National Geographic, and it's getting replayed and rerun other places because she is both a human being and a journalist, and her own personal story became relevant. So with some of the students in my class, I encourage them, photograph what's happening to you on a daily basis. Who are the people you're sheltering in place with, and what does their daily life look like? How has it changed? How is it impacted? Because journalism is the first draft of history. Is one of the quotes we like to throw around, and it's happening to all of us in real time. So if we document what's happening to us at home, in our communities, very close to home, we are making a record that's valuable for the future. And for people now who want to know what do my neighbors do all day long? What do their lives look like when they have little kids and they're trying to homeschool and go to work and juggle multiple things and get their groceries into the house safely? Like, what does that look like? It's reassuring to see how our neighbors are surviving right now and to see imagery of that. So I tell my students, photograph what you have access to and what you feel safe documenting, what you can be safe recording.
And I mean, it's also worth noting that, sorry, Beth, but it's also worth noting that normally journalists don't cover themselves or family members. Like, that's normally kind of a breach of like the ethics that we're talking about. But at least for our class and for a lot of this, it's kind of the only way to do it now, to not.
We're usually not the story, and we don't like to be the story, and it's not necessarily beneficial because it's a conflict of interest. And we have our own personal perspective, and it's hard to get distance from that as a journalist. But in these times, there are opportunities to tell our own stories that might be valuable.
Yeah, and this is a rare moment in time when a story is affecting everybody on the planet. Almost universally, I mean, in the same ways. That's not often the case with news. There can be news that affects a large number of people, a hurricane, the economic downfall, but this is a story that transcends every barrier on the planet. And it's kind of hard to remove yourself from it because you are part of it.
Yeah.
It's really an opportunity, isn't it, to teach journalism right now, as challenging as it is. There has never been, to my knowledge, another incident, another moment in time where everyone is touched a little bit by the same thing, other than just being alive and being human. There's something that's happening that we can't control, that's affecting everyone. That virus has no boundaries. So of course it affects different people in different places in different ways based on their country, their government, their socioeconomic class, their biology. But other than those factors that are different, there is one thing that we are all trying to combat together, and that's this deadly virus. So it's really a wonderful opportunity, as strange as that sounds, to be a journalist and reimagine what it means to be human in a new way. And that's part of our job. So I think it's an opportunity.
Yeah. And Beth, too, kind of going off of what you said, what role, I mean, because we've talked a lot about the New York Times, Washington Post, these big national media outlets, but what role does like local journalism play in telling this story of the pandemic that's not just covering breaking news from a press conference from like Clay Jenkins or the latest numbers of people that have gotten infected.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There is another journalism phrase we use that, all news is local. Even the biggest stories on the planet, you can drive them down to the people they affect. And again, as Kale said, they affect people in different ways, depending on a lot of factors in life. But people are naturally more inclined to be interested in things that are happening in their own community than they are across the world. And it's important to be a global citizen and pay attention to the entire world. But they feel the impact at home. And so, yes, covering the press conferences are important because we need to know what are the new rules that they're setting. Everybody in Dallas has to start wearing a mask. And so those are facts that we need. But local journalists are the ones who know the people who know things. And they're also the ones who, like Kale mentioned earlier when she was talking about the photos, and the photographer who lives in that community in Italy and did all of that great work. They have access because they're there, right? And that's how local journalism works. They have access to things in our community because they live here too. And so it's really important to hear the stories that are in our own community. So yes, you're going to see in the Dallas Morning News that they're going to cover those press conferences. They're going to write about the number of deaths. They're going to talk about things that are happening at hospitals, and whether we're going to open the convention center as an extra medical place. But you're also going to see them talking to people in line at the food pantry, and talking to loved ones who have family members who are in the hospital and they can't visit them. And those are really important stories to tell, because that brings everything back to the level of that could be me.
Yeah.
And I think too, like this really points to the importance of having diversity in your media, because we know that the news media is not very diverse. I mean, every year there are new statistics that come out that look at the diversity in the media, and you can see that the news media is predominantly white and male. And we're talking about decision makers in the news media, people who decide what stories are covered and how they're covered. And so if we talk about local community journalism, it's important that right now we're reporting within our own communities. And if everyone lives in Highland Park, or if everyone lives, in one area of our city, then are we really getting a well-rounded, coverage of what's happening in our community?
Yeah, I think that rolls in great into the next question that I was going to ask, and this is for all of you. I'm going to start with you, Kale. But what do you think any type of news media right now is not covering well in this pandemic?
Well, I think this dovetails with what Lori just said. We generally, people who are journalists have jobs. We're employed, tend to be middle class. And we know that the news media is not terribly diverse, that it's mostly white, it's mostly male. Of course, there are exceptions newsroom by newsroom. But I think if your journalists don't live in the community that's the hardest affected. We know that this virus is impacting the Black community more than white community. We know that it affects poor people who live in close quarters, who don't have great health care, that they're more likely to not get tested or to go longer without food or medical care. And that's probably, if history shows us that that's probably going to be underreported in this situation too, based on what other content analyses and examinations of the news media we've seen. So I haven't examined the news media, I haven't done a content analysis of our local news media, but I do feel like I'm not hearing as many stories from South Dallas. I'm not hearing as many stories from communities who are most vulnerable. Also, the Native American community is really vulnerable in places where they're living in close quarters and on reservations, the Navajo community. So I feel like those stories are slower to come to the surface.
Yeah.
I just saw something on that the rate is just skyrocketing among Native American populations.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of underlying health conditions too.
Right. And poverty. Those are the poorest communities in the country.
Yeah.
many of them.
Yeah, and I think generally too, what we're seeing is there's a lot of focus on big cities because they are being astronomically affected. I mean, what's going on in New York is very scary, and it's important to cover it. But there's a lot of rural communities out there who probably are going to be like behind because obviously, you know, the disease is going to be slower to get there because there's fewer people. But there's also fewer doctors, fewer hospitals. The uninsured rate, I believe, in Texas is somewhere over 20%. The worst in the country for states. And so I think those are stories that we're not seeing yet. That I hope that once the kind of initial breaking news part of this slows down a little bit, that we'll start seeing them spread out and get some more stories that are outside of big cities. Because even right now, the focus is on Dallas. It's not, and we're a very large metropolitan area, and not everybody lives in Dallas.
Right.
Yeah.
And also just the geography of newspapers, for example, local newspapers and local news media. I mean, we don't have as many local sources in smaller communities as we used to have. And that's just in the last decade, that's been changing. And the news media itself is suffering an economic downturn already. And then in addition to this economic downturn we're having because of the pandemic. So we're just not getting the same kind of information out of rural communities that we should be getting probably.
Yeah,
and I think it's worth noting. Sorry, I'll let you talk. But what you had just said, Kel, on like news media is that all of these people that we have talked about giving away free coverage are now suffering pay cuts. The Dallas Morning News just had every single one of their staff just got a pay cut. Gannett News, who owns USA Today, they're furloughing people. So this is something that affects journalism too, and news media, and they're still trying to give information out to people. Go ahead, Lori.
Yeah, that's true. And just going back to the point that Beth was making and Kale as well about if you look at a map of Texas and the cases and where we see the highest concentration of cases, and then if you look at those pockets where there are not many cases being reported, a lot of those areas don't have ready access to healthcare. They don't have hospitals in some of those areas. And so you have to wonder, like, and they probably don't have access to these testing, right? So like,
yeah,
how, for all we know, they are having, lots of cases, and people, either it's, they're asymptomatic, and they think they're fine and they're still socializing with their families, or we've heard some horrible stories about entire families being infected by this, awful virus. And so I don't think we really know. So I think I'd like to see more reporting about that. I feel like but then again, we get to the access issue, right? About like traveling to those areas. When we were in Dallas County, even though journalists are an essential service and an essential business, it's still a little difficult access-wise to follow those types of stories. And then also talking about the underlying health conditions of certain segments. Dr. Fauci actually spoke about that in one of the briefings recently, and he brought up basically this is another opportunity for us to look at what we're actually doing with healthcare and how we are providing healthcare in this country. And it's not probably what the president wanted to hear him say, but I think it was an important note that a lot of the problems that we're seeing is because of these underlying health conditions that have been allowed to, that have happened because of lack of access to care over the years.
Yeah, the structural underlying problems that we face as a society are being amplified right now by this virus. And, as reporting continues and it goes on, I hope we see more and more of that discussion about the structural problems that we're facing as a society, and use this as an opportunity to reflect and maybe change things.
Now we've kind of talked about it a little bit, the fake news, that. A lot of people aren't trusting media now. They're not trusting news, even credible news sites. One, is that a problem? And if it is, how do we begin to gain their trust back? This is for all of you. So I'll start with you, Kel.
Well, I think that, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you gain the public's trust back once it's eroded. I mean, certainly we have to just keep doing our jobs. It's not a good time to sit on the sofa and not get out there. If you have a job as a journalist right now, it's a great time to take your job pretty seriously and to think about your individual relationships with your subjects and make sure that you are as professional and as ethical as you can be on the ground while you're doing your work. And, I always feel a little bit hopeful as a teacher of journalism that there are still students who care about this profession, who think it's valuable and are, people like the students at the Et Cetera right now. I mean, you guys are on the front lines. You're doing the job that we all do as professional journalists. So I feel like that's got to count for something.
Yeah, and I think kind of a shining light in all of this is if you look at the studies, and yes, there's jokes about how we're down at the bottom with used car salesmen and lawyers, right? And how does the public feel about us? But if you separate out what people call the media, which that's a totally separate conversation we could have about like kind of this this large dark state that we apparently are, which is just not true. But if you look at how people feel about their local news, about how they feel about journalists in their own community, not the big guys in Washington and New York, not the cable news networks, but how they feel about their local paper, or their local television station or their local radio station, there's some light there because they do trust those people. And again, that goes back to the closeness of a community, of them telling stories in their own community. But, I don't have, if we could answer the question about how to get trust back, we'd be calling Marty Barron at the New York Times and telling him our theory. But nobody's quite figured that out. And I think, like Kale said, the most important part is just keep doing the job. Keep reporting, keep telling those stories, and be ethical and be as accurate as you could possibly be. Don't let anybody put bullets in your story.
Yep. And I hate to do this to you. Marty Barron is at the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
I was going to do that,
Keep
but
moving around.
I think the whole idea of building trust is just an ongoing effort. And I think that it has eroded, and it's hard to withstand the attacks that, we've seen in recent years, the labeling of anything negative as fake news. And unfortunately, we, live in a time where people have access, well, not unfortunately, but we live in a time where people have access to a lot of information. Unfortunately, a lot of that is not good information. And so, my hope is that we can just keep educating people to learn how to differentiate between those. I did have a student who posted a story just a couple of days ago on social media that was clearly satire. And so, I just feel like it's all about education. And that's what all of us have in common here is that, we're trying to, whether we're educators or we're journalists, we're trying to provide accurate information. We're trying to abide by that SPJ code of ethics that we talked about earlier and provide accurate, important, timely information and be a voice for people who otherwise would not have one.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining me here today.
Thank you, Skye. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Will do. And you guys have a great weekend.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks for getting the word out.
Bye. Thank you all for joining me here today. I'm Skye Seipp, Editor-in-Chief of the Et Cetera. You can find us at eastfieldnews.com. You can all check down the description below for any links to any of the sources that we talked about today. And I'm signing off now. Goodbye.